Hello and welcome to August Does Everything. I'm August. On this portion of August Does Everything, we're going to be doing Coffee and Cthulhu Q&A. And just to give you a brief setup, these are questions over the years that I've answered concerning Lovecraft and cosmic horror as a genre. I wrote them some time ago, so I've been collecting and curating them and then adding more now as new material comes out and you discover more things and want to add to the answers. So let's jump right in. This is question 3. Are H.P. Lovecraft stories actually scary, or has he been overhyped? Okay. So just on written material, I think Lovecraft stories can be pretty scary. Not the scariest I've seen, but he's pretty good at building atmosphere and, getting you to think about things. And the real appeal was that he was the first person to approach horror from a more science fiction approach than a fantasy approach. And his monsters came more from outer space or from other dimensions rather than being a ghost in a haunted house or something like that. So, but I wanted to talk about some of the films and horror itself. So, good horror, real horror, true horror has two elements that it can't do without, and that is fear and isolation. Otherwise, if you don't have those elements, you just have like an action movie with monsters or a fantasy adventure with some scary elements, or it's not true horror. It's like action fantasy. So two of the standout pieces that were inspired by Lovecraft and are considered some of the best cosmic horror films came around the late 70s and early 80s. And the first one was Alien, which was in 1979. Ridley Scott directed. I'm sure people have heard of it. If you haven't seen it, check it out. It's a really awesome addition to the cosmic horror genre. And in this movie, you have isolation. There's a small crew on a very large ship, and they're isolated. They're out in space alone, so they can't call for help. So they have to go against this alien. So you have the two elements there. And it's really a pretty tight little story, and great special effects, great production value. The other one is John Carpenter's The Thing, which came out in 1982. Those early 80s were really great for a lot of good fantasy, monster, adventure movies and horror. Some of the most memorable characters come out of the 80s. So John Carpenter's The Thing involved a small group of men, I believe it was 12, in Antarctica, and there's a storm coming, and they're stuck in this small research station with this monster that can imitate humans and change forms. And so once again, you have the fear there, because it's especially acute and intense in this film because they don't know who to trust. So the guy next to you could be the monster, and sometimes it is. So it's a great, thriller, suspense type movie. It wasn't really received too well when it first came out because it was released around the same time as E.T., who was a much friendlier alien. But over the years, it's developed quite a following, and it's become a cult classic. But you have the fear there and the isolation because they're in a research station just miles and miles away from anybody, and they can't contact anybody. There's a scene where they're trying to contact other people, and they can't. So they just have to deal with this thing alone. Now, these aren't Lovecraftian stories. These weren't written by Lovecraft, but they were inspired. John Carpenter has a apocalyptic trilogy, which is very Lovecraftian, and But that was before 2019. So Color Out of Space was released, starring Nicolas Cage. And up until that point, I really hadn't seen anything that I thought was truly good or captured the spirit of Lovecraft. But I think, if you ask me, Color Out of Space is truly horrifying. I think it's a great film in that sense. It's just really leaves you uneasy and disturbed afterwards. Kind of like Seven, I think, was one of the other movies that really kind of left you with a weird, odd feeling, which I think horror is supposed to do. A lot of horror doesn't do that. It's not truly horrifying. But you do have the fear there. You do have the isolation. And it's got, some production value, some special effects. It sticks pretty well to the original story. Of course, there's always going to be changes with film. And they add some elements, like the daughter uses rituals from the Simon Necronomicon rather than the Necronomicon. So that's something else we'll get into. One of the questions is, what is the Necronomicon? So there's the Necronomicon, which is a fictional book. And then there's a Simon Necronomicon, which was really just thrown together by some publishers, by a group of people, to really just make money off the name. It supposedly had, some Mesopotamian or Sumerian rituals or something like that, but it's all just fabricated and, was made to make money. But it's still got a place in pop culture and Lovecraftian mythos. So back to Lovecraft's written stuff, I would say a lot of his stuff is more like a teaser trailer. There's a lot implied about, great old ones from eons ago, and, coming from other dimensions. So he does a pretty good job at that. These gods and monsters and necromancers and dimensional gates. And him and Robert E. Howard were correspondents, so we even see how you see some of the elements of Lovecraftian fiction in other worlds, like Sword and Sorcery, like Robert E. Howard. Conan fights some of these creatures, eldritch abominations. And of course there's the Kitab al-Azif, which allows one to travel through time and space. So you're going to encounter all kind of monsters there. But I still think Lovecraft had some great stories. Some of them were fair to middling, and others weren't so good. But he never really hit his. He never really lived up to his full potential. And I think he was very experimental. He wasn't consistent, but he certainly did a good job in sort of creating this expanded universe that a lot of other writers, use some of the concepts with, which is known as Yog-Sothothery. His stories elicit fear. In a sense, they're coming off the Gothic horror movement with the ambience and atmosphere, like I think Castle of Otranto. I'm not sure if I'm getting the title right, but that was one of the standout pieces, and he was obviously influenced by that. In those Youth, Beauty, Love, Death. Castle of Otranto captures all those things. There's Lineage, which was a big part of Lovecraft's writing. I think he took that, but he changed the source. So the source of horror is no longer the family or hauntings or ghosts like that. It's something from outside of space. And the Byronic hero from Lord Byron grew out of the Gothic Romantic movement, and Lovecraft associated himself with things older, and he had a manner of speaking that was more like from that era rather than being more progressive. sullen, withdrawn, hard to like, hard to know, but usually possessing a rich inner life, and softer side accessible only to a special few. So yeah, his life was pretty short. He died at 46 from cancer. So, writing is one of those things where you usually get better as you get older, because you just keep developing your craft, you mature, you just have a better sense of things to balance, parts of the story. And he definitely had some great stories near the end of his life and end of his career. But I don't think he ever hit his peak, his zenith. And it's a shame. But he still remains a big inspiration for games and other writers, sculpture, music, everything. And I think his stories, if they're done right, they are quite scary. And you have to remember where he came from up in the Northeast. It was often cold, dark. A lot of people lived in isolated places, near forests, where, maybe now wherever you're living in a more modern place, you don't really have that type of living situation or ambience. You've got more people now around you and more technology, so it's harder to be scared. He's coming up from a time when electricity and things like that were like automobiles were relatively new. So a lot of people lived on a farm. They relied on natural light, and they lived by a forest where it was dark. There was animals. You often hear strange noises and all these types of things. So if you have an active imagination or overactive imagination, you could be pretty scared. But overall, I'd say his stories were quite scary, and they captured the imagination. So stay tuned for the next question. Thanks for coming by, subscribe, and see you later. Bye.